But we have some bad hombres here, and we're going to get them out. You say, I have the most loyal people. Did you ever see that? Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay? When you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab them by the pussy.
You Republican voters support him still. The party is his. It doesn't belong to anybody else.
They want him to go away. Let me tell you this right now. Donald J. Trump ain't going anywhere.
I will always fight for you. I will be watching. I will be listening.
Well, glad that's over. The Trump administration is gone. But Trumpism isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and that is the unfortunate reality. But at the moment, that's not the thing that I'm most angry about. The thing I'm most angry about, the one incident that lit the match that started me on the road to make this film, was this.
Jews will not replace us!
White lives matter! White lives matter! White lives matter!
I'm here in Charlottesville in Emancipation Park. This was sort of the flashpoint for the whole incident. You can see Robert E. Lee behind me with the Black Lives Matter paint on him and his sword's all painted red. It's a quiet park. It's a very nice little town. And people are jogging, they're going about their business and pretty much ignoring it. It's kind of like, you know, with us in New York in 9/11. It was a thing. We dealt with it, and it's an everyday thing. People come and they go to 9/11, and it's emotional. Standing here, it's emotional. I can imagine what it was like, and it's hard looking at that and understanding the history. You can see how this thing exploded. So I'm here at the spot where Heather Heyer was murdered. As you can see, all the graffiti is still here. It's amazing. It's overwhelming. It's heartbreaking. You have these little flashpoints throughout history that happen. This was a big one. If you think about what happened here and how Trump could actually say there were good people on both sides, it's mind-boggling. Standing here and thinking about that, I just it's why I'm making this movie. We all know anti-Semitism in America is not a new thing. But in fact, it's a very old thing, like over a century.
By the turn of the 20th century, the Jewish population in the United States had reached 1 million women and men. Jews had been in this country ever since 1654, but the critical mass of Jews didn't really start migrating to the United States until really the 1880s in earnest. And what scholars have really figured out is that at the beginning of the 20th century, it was no easy thing to be Jewish in the United States. This was the era of Protestant America, of significant nativism, and in fact, by the 1920s, legislation was passed in which there were severe quotas placed on Eastern European Jewish migration to the United States. I'll give you a couple of examples. Researchers, historians have counted about 40 or 50 colleges and universities that had severe limitations on Jewish enrollment. We're talking about Harvard, Columbia, Adelphi, Northwestern, certainly here in Chicago. Major universities put limitations, put caps, covenants that restricted Jewish migration to particular neighborhoods. And then most interesting, perhaps of all, is the liquor trade. Jews were most tightly associated as purveyors of alcohol during the period of Prohibition. And even preceding that, you had the temperance movement and the Prohibition movement, even before the legislation, before the amendment. Jews were seen as somehow to be responsible for what they called loose morals associated with alcohol, with the alcohol trade in the United States.
So in the United States, we have multiple forms of anti-Semitism. This is not unusual. We have this in places like France as well. Anti-Semitism from the left, anti-Semitism right, anti-Semitism from radical Islamists, other forms of anti-Semitism, religious anti-Semitism, etc. But I'm always a little suspicious when people want to just say, oh, anti-Semitism is a problem of the left, or anti-Semitism is a problem of just the nationalist right, or et cetera, because it's just not true. At a given time, it may be a predominant form, but this can also change very quickly. This is not about left and right politics. It's not about Democrats and Republicans. We just have to be factual. If Democrats say something that's anti-Semitic, we need to call it out. If Republicans say something that's anti-Semitic, we need to call it out. Particularly, it's important that people who are Democrats particularly don't ignore anti-Semitism on the left. People, Republicans, don't ignore anti-Semitism on the right, even if it's from their leaders on either side. Making this a partisan issue is very damaging. And, I think one of the things that I've heard from the left that's true, and I'm a person on the left, frankly, is that over the last, some number of years, certainly the last decade, most of the violence against Jews in the United States, again, we need to look at and think about time and place when we talk about anti-Semitism. But in the United States, the place and the time last decade, can truthfully say most of the violence has come from the nationalist right. Now, violence is an important piece when you kind of analyze how much of a threat anti-Semitism is. It's not the only piece, by the way. One of the things I also like to look at is what institutions are instituting the violence. If it's the government being the one institution in any society that has a monopoly on violence, that is very threatening. And one of the things that characterized the anti-Semitism in the 1930s and the lead up to the Holocaust were governments, not just Nazi Germany, but lots and lots of governments in Europe that were dealing and were anti-Semitic, dealing in anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic. We have governments that play with anti-Semitism. We have a few governments in the world, like let's say Iran, that are clearly anti-Semitic, but it's very different than the 1930s. But violence is a very important thing, and that is a fact. But it doesn't mean that right-wing anti-Semitism is the only form of anti-Semitism we worry about. And what we saw this past year in particularly is what some people would call the Corbynization of parts of the progressive left in the United States. And you saw that in May. Now, this does not mean that criticism of Israel is inherently anti-Semitic. That is absolutely false. Israel needs to be treated just like any other nation, whether you're a Zionist or not. Israel can be criticized. But there are times that that criticism crosses a line into anti-Semitism. And there are signs that you can use. If you see something that looks like it's out of the protocols of the elders of Zion, which instead of using the term Jew, you use the term Israel, and in the exact same sentence, well, it's reasonable to say, what's going on here? When you hear people saying things about how Israel treats the Palestinians, that is not necessarily anti-Semitic at all. You have to depend on what it says. When people say Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians, then you have to wonder, because that's not the definition of genocide, or even ethnic cleansing. Well, if Israel's committing ethnic cleansing, you can criticize Israel for treatment of Palestinians. When Israel's committing ethnic cleansing, if they are, then they've been the least successful country in the world history that's ever committed ethnic cleansing, because the Palestinian population of what one might call Greater Palestine, certainly Israel, the West Bank, has exploded since Israel's occupation began in 1967. That's not ethnic cleansing. So there is a anti-Semitism on the left, which is disturbing. It's not an anti-Semitism that pervades on the left, but there is a problem with the demonization of Israel that sometimes crosses over into anti-Semitism.
So continuing on with our anti-Semitism theme, it's kind of hard to believe that there are actually Jews in Montana. What's not hard to believe is that there's anti-Semitism in Montana. I traveled out to Whitefish, Montana to investigate a rather heinous anti-Semitic event that occurred in 2016.
The founder of a neo-Nazi website is facing a lawsuit for allegedly targeting a Jewish woman in Montana with a, quote, troll storm. Andrew Anglin, who founded the Daily Stormer, has been accused of launching a, quote, campaign of terror against the woman, publishing her personal information on his website and triggering an army of neo-Nazi internet trolls to make thousands of hateful and terrorizing threats against her and her family. We have to warn you, some of the language you're about to hear is explicit and might be disturbing, but it illustrates the depth of hate in America today. Here's CNN's Sarah Seidner.
They call themselves trolls. What do you call them?
Terrorists.
In the digital era, it only takes a few keystrokes for hate to suddenly consume your life.
You worthless piece of shit.
This is what is often waiting for Tanya Gersh every day when she goes online or picks up the phone.
I hope you die, you worthless stupid, ugly bitch, Miss Tanya Gersh.
I had a lot of phone calls with gunshots. That sound kind of still makes me sick.
The Gershes, including their 12-year-old son, have received thousands of messages like this for months.
Your whore of a mother should watch herself. Why don't you crawl into this oven, little boy? There's a free Xbox inside. They photoshopped endless imagery of me with Nazi symbols on my forehead or on my arm, and terrible imagery of me and my son on the gates to Auschwitz concentration camp.
You think it scarred them?
Yeah. Every time I start to tell the story, I have to pause a little bit and just shake my head because I can't even believe it's true. To tell you the truth, it still seems so unreal, even having lived through it myself. It's first important to know that my friends used to call me the happiest person on the planet. I am generally a super positive, happy, don't sweat the small stuff kind of gal. My life was just everything that I ever hoped for.
When we moved here 20 years ago, there was an ongoing hate radio station here in the Valley, spewing hate. It eventually got shut down. But the start of the more recent hate activity was when a group called Pioneers of Little Europe began showing pro-Nazi films in the local library. And a group led by Ina and myself, a minister and a layman, formed a group called Love Lives Here to counter the films. The films were once a month. And the counters succeeded. So much so that in April of that year, and I think it was 29 or 2010, they were showing their first film on Passover. Now, we couldn't attend to counter, but something like 65 locals mounted a demonstration. And that demonstration became Love Lives Here.
After Trump was elected, Richard Spencer, who started the alt-right movement, did a conference, a convention in Washington, D.C., where he stood up in front of a room full of his supporters and hailed our president.
Hail Trump! Hail our people! Hail victory!
And I saw that. And the reason that I saw it, and the reason I cared, and the reason that I noticed was because Richard Spencer lives in Whitefish, in my peaceful little town. Now, I promise you, nobody in Whitefish likes that he lives in this town. He has been known to say that he lives in this town because it's so white, and everybody leaves him alone, and he can be who he wants to be in this little town.
The one thing that absolutely boggles my mind is that Trumpism should be a thing. I mean, Donald Trump, as a human, fails every basic humanity test on the scale. Yet, he's become an ism. But not only has he become an ism, he's become an ism that isn't going anywhere anytime soon. How did that happen?
There are basically two categories of Trump supporters. One is the relatively affluent economic conservatives who think Trump is a jerk but voted for him anyway because they liked his policies, which are very conservative. The other category are people who are disproportionately rural, disproportionately below average income, not well educated, and people who feel like life has not been going well for them. And they mostly think that that's because people who are not white, so African Americans, Latinos, are taking stuff from them, taking opportunities from them, and these are people who Trump learned to speak to back in his days with the Apprentice TV show, where he learned how to talk their language, basically. And he then applied that to his presidential campaigns. And what he's built up is essentially a charismatic relationship with this group of ne'er-do-wells who just basically don't think that life is going well for them, and they tend to think that American society used to be white-dominated, and they think that's the way it should be, and they think things are going to hell in a handbasket.
Trump coming on the scene, I saw that he checked all the boxes. From the very start, he was trying to forge a bond with his followers that would lead them to believe in him so that they would believe his lies, and to accord him a special status that no other president, Republican or Democrat, had ever had before, a cult status. And he found his best supporters in evangelical Christians and Orthodox Jews. Both groups proclaimed him there by the will of God to save the nation. And this is very important. And so there's a utopian aspect to strongmen rule, where they're going to make the nation better. They're going to make it great. And so they hold out the promise of this better future that only they can deliver to the country.
I alone can fix it. I will restore law and order to our country.
I'm going to make our country rich again.
And that's very, very key to how they get people's hopes up and how people bond to them as a kind of savior. And yet, it's not just making the nation great, it's making the nation great again. Because they also channel nostalgia for this mythical better past. So many strong men talk about lost empires. So Mussolini in fascist Italy 100 years ago talked about the Roman Empire. Today in Turkey, Erdogan talks about reviving the Ottoman Empire. Now in America, Trump didn't have an empire to go on. So it was a kind of past when women and people of color and workers knew their places. So it was about preserving white Christian and devout white male supremacy in particular. So the nostalgia and the utopia fuse together into this kind of ideology of authoritarianism. And Trump has been expert at delivering that ideology to millions of followers.
And of course, the ultimate strongman was Adolf Hitler. They say that if you don't remember history, you're doomed to repeat it. Well, apparently, Donald Trump remembered just enough history to pull out Adolf Hitler's old playbook and put it to good use.
Even acknowledging the obvious that Trump is not Hitler, what bears reflecting on are sort of three salient points. The first would be, as a point of comparison, the place of conspiracy theories spread by the Nazis and then before they came to power and then certainly after they came to power. And connected to it, the whole idea of fake news, which had a certain currency in the Weimar Republic. As far as conspiracy theories are concerned, Nazism is a political ideology formed in reaction to a belief that Germany was a victim had fallen victim to a set of conspiracy theories. The most important one being, in the immediate short-term one, being what was called in Germany the stab in the back theory, the idea that leftists and pacifists, and in particular Jews, had stabbed Germany in the back during World War I, and it was they who were responsible for Germany's defeat and the settlement in the Versailles Treaty that cast Germany as the party that was solely responsible for all the damage of World War I and responsible for having started it. And then the second conspiracy theory is one of much longer lived provenance, that is the World Jewish Conspiracy. They're not entirely separate, of course, the stab in the back theory, but the World Jewish Conspiracy. And Hitler's Mein Kampf was really an explanation of the way he saw the world and how he saw it as, and used it as a blueprint to eliminate the Jews so as to crush the conspiracy. They refused to accept responsibility for the loss. Germany could never have been beaten, they said, by external enemies. It could only have succumbed to internal enemies. It resonates, of course, with the idea that we heard with the November election.
Make sure, because the only way we're going to lose this election is if the election is rigged. Remember that.
The only way they can take this election away from us is if this is a rigged election.
It's a rigged election. It's the only way we're going to lose. It's rigged. The rig is rigged.
And that it was simply not possible for Trump to have lost in a sort of a fair election fight. It could only, his defeat could only have come about by internal enemies and the treasonous behavior and the cheating behavior of Biden.
One of the most fundamental questions I had going into this film was, how could Jews of any sect support a man who is so morally and ethically bankrupt as Donald Trump? not once, but twice.
And so the American Jewish Committee, right before the 2020 election, conducted a very important study of voting patterns or voting intentions for the 2020 election. And it reported that an overwhelming majority of Orthodox Jews in the United States were prepared to vote for President Trump and not for then Vice President Joe Biden. American Jewish voters, particularly but not necessarily particularly, I should say, in the Orthodox community, that a vote for Trump is a vote for the Jews, is a vote for Israel. That's number one. Number two, and you start to hear it more and more, which is it's a vote against the Democratic candidate. And the perception that the Democratic Party is moving increasingly further to the left. That could be on religious freedoms. It could be when thinking about abortion and Supreme Court appointees, Roe v. Wade. And which is interesting because that's not the one issue voter, right? A one issue voter says, you know what, I don't really care about that. I care about a vote for Israel. But here, what's happening is that the community, the Orthodox, particularly the yeshiva world's community, which was for so long set apart from Western society by becoming a stakeholder in religious value, what they determine to be religious values and religious freedoms, they are playing their role in American civic life.
So, the rise of Trump is one of the things that spurred me on to make this film. The increase in anti-Semitism between 2015 and 2020 is actually documentable. The ADL says that in that time period, there was a 60% rise in anti-Semitism and over 2,000 separate documentable anti-Semitic events. Now, the Jewish people are 2.5% of the population. That's a whole lot of hate shoved into a very short period of time. And yet, I still can't get anybody to talk to me and go on the record about the rise of anti-Semitism. I feel like I'm making this movie all by myself.
One thing I've noticed as a journalist is it's coming more and more out of the mouths of public officials. It's just so disheartening to see this, and I have to believe that it's because people have very little understanding of history, very little understanding of what America went through in World War II, when these same peoples, their grandfathers or their fathers went off to war and saw horrible things and basically saved democracy.
I'm in Lowell, Massachusetts, and in February of 2021, a local council person on his public access show, City Life, called another local council person a kike. The Jewish guy, the kike.
We lost the kike. Oh, I mean the Jewish guy. I hate to say it, but that's what people used to say behind his back.
And there's two things that bother me about this. Firstly, that he felt it was perfectly fine to use that word on a public television show, kike. But second, that nobody did anything about it for about 30 minutes. Nobody realized that maybe they shouldn't have said that on television. So it took a while for them to get him off or turn off the show or whatever it is they chose to do. There was some uproar afterwards, and I think he was told to resign. But kike is a word I haven't heard since I was in high school. And now we've heard it from a professional basketball player and this yokel in Massachusetts. It's amazing to me that in 2021, this still happens.
In the hours and days following the anti-Semitic slur, which I might add is an arcane slur only used now by white supremacists and neo-Nazis, there was a big outcry from the community, and as the story went national and international, there was a call for him to resign. He eventually did resign 2 days after he made the statement. Still, the damage was done. This man is now what many see as the poster boy for a new kind of hate speech. A hate speech by politicians. A hate speech that has risen in recent years in America. A disturbing trend that threatens the civil liberties of Americans and especially Jews.
I think it's difficult and sometimes unproductive to call people anti-Semitic. You call Hitler anti-Semitic. You call people who say I hate Jews anti-Semitic. And sometimes when people's actions speak so clearly, you might want to call them anti-Semitic. We live in a country today that is deeply divided on partisan lines, and partisanship, from my perspective, can be a good thing. But when everything becomes partisan, it has some very negative consequences. And this is an issue that I think it's really important we don't act out of our partisan instincts. And since my early part of my career was all in Democratic politics, and I am still a strong Democrat, I try to be careful about how I talk about particularly Republicans on this issue. But let's talk about some of the things President Trump has done. On the one hand, Trump will argue, and I think legitimately, that he's been a good friend of Israel. Some people would say, well, those policies may not the best, but arguably he could make that point. He was close to Prime Minister Netanyahu. He's got family that's Jewish, etc. On the other hand, there are some problematic statements and problematic things. The campaign in 2016 at the end ran a piece with Hillary Clinton and a Jewish star, which kind of could imply that Jewish money was behind Hillary, and many people criticized him for him. Some of his comments at organizations like the Republican Jewish Coalition about you people or I don't need your money could be construed. I think there were other times he talked about good people on both sides in reference to Charlottesville. We could go on and on. There are other times he was very clearly condemning anti-Semitism. I think what we can go through all those things and people can make judgments about them. Some of them I think are truly very problematic. But I think one of the things we definitely can say is in the Trump era of his running for president and being president, there was a rise in anti-Semitism in this country. There was, part of that was a breaking down of traditional taboos of what you could say about Jews, or making reference, even if you don't use the term Jew, that lots of people knew what you were talking about, that in maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago would have put you outside of polite society. And in this period, that's broken down. Now, is that directly attributable to Trump? Is it all about Trump? I can be a little skeptical. I think it has something to do with the former president, and I think that's fair. But focusing just on Trump and dealing with anti-Semitism, I don't think gets you very far. And that doesn't mean that the president, that president, or any president can't be criticized in these areas. You can, and it's legitimate to talk about some of the things that he did. But I'm not so focused on Trump is the problem when it comes to anti-Semitism.
Ethics and morality. You would think with the rise of anti-Semitism under the Trump administration, this would give the Jewish community a pause and say, hey, how are we supporting this guy? I mean, let's face it, of all the qualities that Trump is lacking, ethics and morality are two big ones. I was always taught that these are the cornerstones of Jewish life. I guess some people were absent that day.
Yeah, so ethics is really central to Judaism, from the Bible to its further developments in the medieval and the modern period. And the concern with ethics is something that Jewish thinkers have really put a strong emphasis and developed very, very strongly. In the modern period, which is the period that I study, one sees this great concern with character, right? And there's a German word, Bildung, which refers to, is sometimes translated as education, but it represents this ideal of a development of a harmonious character where ethics is really at the center of it. And in the modern period, Jews from across the spectrum, from Orthodoxy to Reform to secular Jews, have really emphasized this element of ethics and of the development of ethical character, and connected that to a broader social concern, a broader concern with the well-being of Jews, but also of all humanity. And I think what we see with the development of Jews supporting Trump is really this moving away from this principle and from this ethical ideal, and conceiving ethics in a very, very narrow way, as really focused primarily on the well-being of the Jewish community alone. But in a very kind of narrow-sighted way, right? There's a sense, I think many Jews have, that, well, Trump is good for Israel. Trump, has a Jewish daughter and son-in-law, and is sympathetic to the Jews, or at least sympathetic to Jewish interests. And the other side of Trump's, anti-Semitism and stoking of this racism and these kind of broader these broader ethical failings is really ignored within the Jewish community, and sort of put aside as something, unimportant. To my mind, I think what this kind of reflects is something that, in many ways comes out of, I think, a reaction to the Holocaust. And that is this real emphasis on Jewish survival as the most important dimension of Judaism at all costs. Now, some people interpret Jewish survival as requiring, well, I should stand for social justice and try to help the oppressed, whoever they may be. But there's another interpretation of Jewish survival that really emphasizes the well-being and the safety and the security of the Jewish people at all costs, and that's very strongly linked to Israel. And I think that when Judaism is conceived in that way, it becomes a very tribalistic, endeavor, a very tribalistic project. And to my mind, that loses what's most important about Judaism. Judaism is not just about survival. It's about living a good life. It's about living an ethical life. It's about something higher. And I think that has been lost in a lot of the support for Trump.
So now we have a better understanding of why the Orthodox community supports Trump, despite the moral and ethical questions which we're just going to ignore. The real question is, how does he keep them?
So the other thing that's kind of interesting about what's going on in the contemporary Haredi community in the United States is that on the one hand you have a skepticism of authority, whether it's Mayor de Blasio or whether it's other people in the city that are asking them to kind of shut their yeshivot, shut their schools, shut their synagogues. You have the kind of rise of Trump and Trumpism in the Haredi world, which is actually quite an interesting phenomenon, because generally the Haredim are, they vote in blocks. They generally are much more interested in regional politics, city politics, community politics, and they aren't really that interested in national politics. Not that they don't vote, they do vote, but that's not really where their bread and butter is. They're really interested in the goods and resources that the city and the state can bring them. And what I think we found, which is so fascinating, is this embrace of a very authoritarian leader in Donald Trump in ways that I think we really haven't seen, at least certainly in the Haredi community in the United States, and I would say even in Europe as well. I mean, generally, Haredim are kind of transactional politically, meaning that they support those candidates and those parties that will maximize their goods and resources. And that's really how they choose candidates. Now, traditionally, most ultra-Orthodox Jews, most Jews in America are Democrats. Most Orthodox Jews were traditionally Democrats, and most ultra-Orthodox Jews were Democrats. And many of the regional and city candidates that are elected in the Haredi neighborhoods were really always Democrats. The Republicans were never really reached into that world. So it's fascinating that the Haredim did not only embrace Trump, but they embraced Trump in a way that we've really never seen before. I mean, the fact that you had parades in Borough Park with pickup trucks driving down 13th Avenue or 16th Avenue with Trump flags, and you had these Trump rallies in the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods. I don't think we've ever really seen that before. I mean, there were a lot of Haredim that supported Reagan. But Reagan did a lot for the Haredi community. It gave them ethnic minority status and a number of other things. Trump didn't really give the Haredim anything in particular, and yet they saw in him some kind of a strong leader. The question of Israel, of course, is an interesting one because generally speaking, the Haredim are not Zionists. And they may be pro-Israel in a way, but that's not usually an issue that they vote on. But somehow Trump's capitulating to the Israeli government, particularly Benjamin Netanyahu, somehow resonated with them in ways that it hasn't before. So I wouldn't say that many of those Haredim were Zionists. They would certainly not consider themselves Zionists. But they saw his strong position pro-Israel as something very important for them. And so you had this kind of mix where Trump emerges as a figure that almost has world historical importance. You know, a Haredi person that I know, that I communicate with sometimes, told me that he feels like Trump is like the second Cyrus the Great. I mean, Cyrus the Great, of course, was an emperor in Persia who, according to tradition, kind of funded the Jews to return to the land of Israel and build the second Jerusalem temple. And he's considered to be a heroic and figure in Jewish history. So they kind of mythologized Trump into this almost redemptive Gentile figure and embraced a particular kind of political platform that seemed kind of very unusual for them.
It's very frustrating to deal with the hypocrisy, and especially on this issue, the blind spots that when people are attached to a strongman, they develop blind spots where they only want to see some sides and not others.
Why is this necessary? Well, sir, we have seen the Marxists attack children and families and women. I believe that either foreign intelligence officers or local militant groups incited the conflict.
I feel it was people like Antifa, Black Lives Matter, who infiltrated the crowd.
This was a stolen election. There'll be a price sooner or later.
I want my President Trump standing up there being inaugurated as an extended president of the United States.
And here's the thing, the strongman is expert at saying one thing at 9 a.m. to one group and the opposite at 9 p.m. to another group. And somehow he gets away with it.
Cult of personality, because some of this seems counterintuitive. So much of the support for President Trump was around his cult of personality. And so Orthodox Jews voted in spite of that. I remember that leading up to the 2020 election, one very prominent rabbinic figure in the yeshiva world, he was reported in different news outlets as having said, dismissing Donald Trump's behavior of something like, I don't think I'm paraphrasing much, but so what? This is how all Gvirim, how rich philanthropists, that's how they speak. It's not my experience. But there is, I think that some of the bravado is there, but I don't think that's the major reason. I think it really has to do with sense of religious liberties, Israel. Also, remember, Jews like to use biblical archetypes, biblical categories to understand their present moment. So, I remember leading into 2016, there was a sense that here you have this Achashverosh character, this king, the Persian king in the Purim story. If you have an Achashverosh, you have to have a Haman. Not sure who that was, but you had a Queen Esther, which is Ivanka Trump, who recently converted to Judaism. An Orthodox Jewish conversion, mind you. And so it fit a certain narrative for many people trying to look the other way with some of his behaviors.
Evangelicals, that question that you just posed about how could the Orthodox vote for such a lowlife as former President Trump, who is all the things that you probably said and more, you could ask that of all of those preachers and so-called Bible believers. I mean, you could ask that about the people who broke into the Capitol, who blessed Jesus and thanked God for helping them break the law and attack democracy. Those are questions that are not unique to the Orthodox. Those are real conundrums, and I think part of it has to do with hate speech, hate radio, hate TV, that is in general unleashed a culture war that makes the years of the Vietnam and civil rights culture wars seem like a party.
It was so unbelievable that the media was covering this, first of all, and gave him the time of day. And the fact that it happened and then it went viral nationally, and of course it went viral in Whitefish. So it started with that. So because this happened, I happened to live right next to Sherry and Richard Spencer's building downtown. And I watched a reporter stop to take pictures of the building. And I was scared. I realized at that moment that my internal fear was warranted, that this is real and this is dangerous. And watching a reporter take pictures of the building, I knew, oh no, this is going to be painful for Whitefish. And I happened to know the woman who ran her business out of that building. So I called her when I witnessed this myself, and I just told her, oh my heavens, I want you to know what I just witnessed. I would highly recommend putting a sticker in the window of some sort that you do not support the ideologies of Richard Spencer in your window or something, because I don't want your business to be harmed by this. And I believe it was her that gave my number to Sherry Spencer, the mother of Richard Spencer. Sherry called me, she asked me, what do I do? And I told her my very honest answer. I said, Sherry, assuming of course that she was calling me because I'm a real estate agent. She knew I was a real estate agent. I said, Sherry, if this were my son, I would probably sell that building. Oh, and she told me, she asked me what should I do, because she told me flat out that she didn't believe in the ideologies of her son. She told me that she was heartbroken that that he could potentially hurt Whitefish. And my heart broke for her at that point. Mother to mother, I just couldn't imagine if this were my son. And so I said, Sherry, if this were my son, I would sell the building, I would donate some money to someone like the Human Rights Network, and then I would make a public statement that I don't believe in the ideologies of my son. And she said, Tanya, thank you. That's exactly what I should do. Will you help me? And I said yes. And at that moment, like I mentioned, I felt like the biggest peacekeeper. I was so excited. I immediately went into action, and I put a listing agreement together. I called, texted my office, my broker, and I said, I don't want to make money off of this sale. How little of a commission can we possibly charge her? She does not want to sell this building. And they told me that they would do it for next to nothing. I was so grateful. I put it together, I sent it off to her, and I said, Sherry, here it is. Let me know anything I can do to help. She was excited too. Within a few days, she had written a letter to a website called the Medium, which we later found out that was not written solely by her. It was also written by Richard Spencer and Nina Spencer, Richard's ex-wife, accusing me of extortion. That article got picked up by a website called the Daily Stormer. And the Daily Stormer was the biggest neo-Nazi website in our country. They had 300,000 followers. I had never heard of the Daily Stormer. I didn't know the Daily Stormer existed. I had no idea that Nazis were actually organized in our country. I was out one night with friends to dinner, and I came home and it was dark out. It was about 9 o'clock. I actually got a text from my husband and said, could you please come home? I have something really, really important to talk to you about. So I left my party early. I came home, and I came home to a dark house, and which was weird. And the front door was locked, and we never lock our doors. And I noticed all of the shades in the house were drawn, and it was dark. And I knocked on the door. So I immediately knew like something is really wrong. And Judah, my husband, answered the door, and he said, come here, I need to show you something. I need to show you something. House was completely black, except for a lamp on in my bedroom. We went into my bedroom, and there was a piece of luggage sitting on the floor. And there was a laptop, and it was open on my bed. And he showed me the picture of my face, and with a big headline that said The Daily Stormer. And I was still a little bit confused, like, what is this? And he said, Tanya, read what this says. And I read my name, my phone number, my address, my contact information, my email address, my office address, my husband's office address, my Facebook tag, my Facebook page, my Twitter, my like every way they could get a hold of me was listed, and it said, "Are you ready for an old-fashioned troll storm?" I don't remember exactly what it said. It was something along the lines of, "We are going to make her life a living hell. How dare she extort the mother of Richard Spencer? We are going to visit her, we are going to email her, we're going to call her, and we're going to tell her what we think of her. And we don't have to touch her to kill her, because we're going to drive her to the brink of suicide." And that's what they did.
So as if to underscore how few people would actually talk to me, Rabbi Joshua Grunberg of Temple Chizuk Emunah in Baltimore was only one of 2 rabbis that would actually go on the record. Is it any wonder I'm angry?
So recently on the Johns Hopkins campus, there was a Muslim teaching assistant who posted something on Twitter that was significantly anti-Semitic about an internal sort of quandary about how to grade Jewish students.
Jewish students at Johns Hopkins were stunned this past November when a teaching assistant posted a poll for her Twitter followers asking, if you have to grade a Zionist student's exam, do you still give them all their points even though they support your ethnic cleansing? The 2 poll choices, yes, be a good TA, or free Palestine, fail them. The TA later deleted both the tweet and her Twitter account, but Jewish organizations on and off campus had already taken notice, including Howard Libet, the president of the Baltimore Jewish Council.
I think her language makes it clear that she has a hatred of Jews, not just those who support Israel. But I would also say it is wrong to threaten grades based on your views of Israel, just like I would condemn if a Jewish student were to threaten the grades of someone who supports Palestinians. That would be wrong too.
The TA declined an interview request, but confirmed Johns Hopkins is investigating the incident.
I think a lot of times the instances of anti-Semitism are stupid kids doing stupid things, not knowing the gravity of what it is that they're doing. There are definitely instances of anti-Semitism, and interestingly enough, here in Pikesville, where these synagogues are, we do live in a little bit of a bubble. And as you would go north of here, as you would go west of here, you would certainly see more instances of anti-Semitism. But we're not immune by any stretch of the imagination. I wouldn't say that we have a systemic anti-Semitism problem in Baltimore the way maybe there are in other communities, because I also want to acknowledge and be appreciative of the good of the community. You know, having only been in the Baltimore community for 3 years, certainly over the last year there's been an uptick. It feels like the first 2 years they were few and far between, and over the last year there's definitely been an uptick. Now, I don't know how much of that is political, and the truth is the political nature of Baltimore is very interesting. So on the one hand, people forget that here in Baltimore, Maryland, we are south of the Mason-Dixon line. And in a lot of respects, there are vestiges of the South here. You know, anytime you have an ultra-Orthodox population that tends to abut up to populations that are just not comfortable with them and just not knowledgeable about them, there are definitely, you know, areas where anti-Semitism rears itself here from the political perspective. And where, you know, we as a Jewish community here in Baltimore run the political gamut, right? We have people in the Jewish community who are as liberal politically in the American landscape as you find, and people who are pretty right wing, and we're probably in that way a little bit more diverse than the average sort of northeastern / mid-Atlantic Jewish community.
I've been covering crime in Miami for the better part of 20 years, and over that time I've written about a lot of anti-Semitic crime, a lot of hate crimes, and sort of how a lot of these rising sentiments in anti-Semitism have bubbled their way into physical manifestations out here in Florida. In those 20 years, I've covered a litany of hate crimes, a litany of anti-Semitic crimes, and I think one of the things I found most interesting in my evolution, which I started here in the early 2000s, and of course, it's a much different environment when it comes to online propaganda, online misinformation, disinformation, and ways for people to sort of express themselves in these hateful ways. Of course, you have the outlier type of cases that, when I say outliers, you know, this is like the really violent type of anti-Semitic cases that you see occasionally. For example, we had a couple years ago, we had an older man who was arrested for trying to set fire to a building here in Miami Beach, and his plan was to kill Jewish people. And when the police department went into his house, they found just tons of Nazi memorabilia, Hitler mugs and SS flags, and he was charged with attempted murder with the hate crime enhancement. Those don't tend to happen as much. That's like a very visceral, almost like a movie villain type of case. But what I think happens more, and which is probably a little more disturbing from a societal end, is just the online harassment and the harassment of Jewish people in the streets, right? You see it bubbling up. You see, especially in 2020, when you know, everything moved online, right? So everything was going to Zoom, and they were having Zoom congregation meetings, Zoom, you know, school orientations, Zoom classes, all these things, where suddenly you're getting anti-Semitic Zoom bombing. You know, people making anti-Semitic comments, making you know, online threats. So I mean, I think the ADL in 2020, I think documented something like almost 100 cases of online harassment and real-world harassment, and that was up in Florida from the mid-60s the year before, right? So it's something that I think is really disturbing from that end, because there's just so many more outlets for people to express this stuff that they're digesting online, and then regurgitating it and hurling it in very, very terrible ways.
I've always worn my Jewishness openly. Never embarrassed to say I'm Jewish. I use my last name Levine. I say it Levine. I don't try to make it anything but Levine. My husband and I have Jewish holidays. We make sure we have Christian people in our home for all Jewish holidays so that they can see how we celebrate it. It's important to us that we keep the faith going. I began working in 1985 as an assistant state attorney in Miami-Dade County, Florida. Initially, I was a pretty liberal person. I thought about joining Amnesty International when I was in law school. I was vehemently opposed to the death penalty. I worked for Janet Reno. She was the first person that gave me a professional job. She was very respected. She was very socially liberal, but she had some conservative values, I thought, which at first I didn't think was very comforting. But the more that I worked for her, the more I liked her. I started out working in the Child Support Enforcement Division because I was actually a family lawyer. After 4 months of working there and realizing that people were having lots of children that they weren't paying for, I was no longer feeling very liberal and much more fiscally conservative. That led me to being more and more aggressive in child support court, and the suggestion was made that maybe I would move over to do some criminal law. So I thought that that was a weird place for me. My thoughts about the death penalty and things like that were very conflicted. But I wanted to do a jury trial, so I figured I'd try my hand at it. I became more involved in criminal law, more conservative, got involved with law enforcement. When you're a prosecutor, you work hand in hand with law enforcement. In general, cops are very conservative. Their values sort of rubbed off on me. And there came a time when there was a discussion in my household. I married to a very liberal Democrat, and I told him that I was going to change my party affiliation to Republican. It didn't cause a divorce, but it didn't sit well. I then went and changed my party affiliation, and I recall voting for my first Republican, Jeb Bush. Time went on, and I heard, like everyone else, that the guy that I had heard many times on Howard Stern, Donald Trump, was going to run for president. And I thought it was a joke. I had heard him so many times on the Stern Show, and he was not a Republican by any stretch of the imagination. He was a Democrat. He supported Hillary Clinton. He talked about abortion. I don't even think he was in favor of the death penalty. He didn't like guns. You know, Howard's a supporter of the Second Amendment, and, you know, he didn't sound like a gun-toting kind of guy to me. He came up on the primary, on the Florida primary. And I am embarrassed to say that I thought it was a joke, and I voted for him. And I was mortified when he carried the state. And I felt like I had really done something, like I was no longer a cog in the wheel. I had really done something that promoted this idiot. By the way, that didn't sit well with my husband. But he continued to gain respect. And my hope was, I was a big Hillary supporter because I was so against him that I thought he was stupid. I thought that he was a showman. He didn't have respect. He didn't understand the Constitution. I'm by no means a constitutional specialist, but I am probably one of the few people that have actually read the Constitution. He didn't know anything. He didn't know one thing. I thought the way he stood behind Hillary Clinton during the debates and made faces at her was just disgusting. I was so turned off. I was furious about it. that he would degrade women. When I heard the Billy Bush conversation, and Billy Bush gets fired and he gets elected president, that never sat with me well. And I became more and more, I guess, angry.
I actually wound up checking out of my hotel in Charlottesville early. I didn't realize how affected I was emotionally, or I would be emotionally, by what happened in Charlottesville. It took me by surprise. And aside from the actual incident, there's a feeling, there's an aura that affected me to the point where I actually was feeling ill. I had to get out of there. So I packed up, I headed south, and I came to the Petersburg battlefield. I'm a big Civil War historian, and I like this battlefield. It's cool, I like it, it's nice. Well, nice, it's a battlefield. But I figured I'd come here and walk around and let some of that go. Well, it didn't work. I still feel crappy. I still feel depressed. But this too shall pass. This is what my movie is about. My movie is about hate. It's about intolerance. It's about anti-Semitism. And these things are real. They happen. While I've been gone, there was 4 synagogues in Westchester or the Bronx or something that were attacked. So, it doesn't stop. It keeps going. My next stop is Charleston, where I'm going to go to Marion Square, where the Holocaust Memorial there was desecrated back in July. So, more feel-good moments for my movie. So here I am in Charleston, South Carolina, at the Holocaust Memorial in Marion Square. Last July, the monument was defaced, and it made one printed article. There was no video footage. There was no national report of it. I found it in one article about anti-Semitism in South Carolina. So I have no video. I've got no photos of the event, because it was obviously taken care of right away. So one more anti-Semitic event, a defacement of a Holocaust memorial that didn't make national news. Go figure.
So what are the qualifications for being a ruthless authoritarian dictator? Well, apparently being a criminal, a liar, a rapist, and a cheat, right high on the application scale. Who knew?
So one of the interesting things in the history of cults of personality is that it's often the most impious and criminal individuals who are accorded this semi-divine status by their followers. And as in so many other things, the template was set by Benito Mussolini, the first dictator who founded fascism. Mussolini was a former socialist, and he was an atheist. He was very anti-clerical, and he was so anti-clerical that in his youth he had written a novel about a cardinal who had a mistress. And but he was the person the Vatican made a deal with, the Lateran Accords in 1929, that restored Catholicism as the official religion in Italy and created the modern independent Vatican state. In the same fashion, 100 years later, here comes Donald Trump, who is, like Mussolini, a serial rapist, a criminal, suspected money launderer, and he's the one who's acclaimed by both Orthodox Jews and evangelical Christians as the man of destiny, the man who will save America. Among the tragedies of the Trump era has been an exponential increase in anti-Semitism. And some people point to the embrace of Trump by Orthodox Jews and the fact that his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is observant, and thus so is his daughter Ivanka. But this doesn't reconcile very well with Trump's embrace of neo-Nazis. And I imagine that those neo-Nazis who staged the rally in Charlottesville were quite amazed to be heralded by the President of the United States as very fine people. I'm sure that even those neo-Nazis didn't expect that from the President of the United States. But this is who Trump is. He is a manipulator, he is an opportunist, he is amoral, and he will embrace any ideology and any group to get power. And he read the political marketplace. He's a marketer. He read the political marketplace in 2015 and saw an opening in exploiting and legitimizing hatred. And hatred of all sorts, but that including anti-Semitism. And so he went after and signaled from the very start to these far-right groups who are anti-Semitic. And this has been, and one of his magic tricks has been to do that consistently while also being acclaimed by Orthodox Jews. And so sometimes people ask, how could this be? But this is the magic of the strongman. It's the same magic that allowed Mussolini to be known by everyone as an atheist and yet embraced by the Vatican, including the Pope called him a man of destiny, but also have thugs beating up people in the streets, black shirts, and also appeal to business people who sit in their clubs with their cigars and consider themselves establishment. And so strongmen, and the same was true with Silvio Berlusconi in Italy much more recently, the strongmen are magicians at cobbling together these constituencies of people who one would think have nothing in common with each other, and also embracing ideologies that can seem contradictory. But this is what the cult of personality does. It reconciles all these contradictions in the body of the ruler.
So, strongman syndrome and Trump notwithstanding, Jews have traditionally been Democrats, going all the way back to Roosevelt. So when did they become Republicans?
And so, all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, I should say by the 1980s, and it's part of the era of Ronald Reagan.
Those of you in the National Association of Evangelicals are known for your spiritual and humanitarian work. And I would be especially remiss if I didn't discharge right now one personal debt of gratitude. Thank you for your prayers. Nancy and I have felt their presence many times in many ways. And believe me, for us, they've made all the difference.
The reach of all different types of religious leaders in the 1980s, that Jews find allies among the Christian right. The Christian right, again, the perception in the 1970s is that most anti-Semitism has to do with the Christian right. All of a sudden, by the 1980s, that perception has given way to allyship, to alliances between the Jewish right, in this case the Orthodox community, and the Christian right. And so I think that when the Republican Party reorganizes itself in the post-war period as America's religious party, Jews are swept up in that. The American Jewish community is one of many American faiths, and so it stands to reason that should be so. So I think that support for Israel, number one. Number two is that Jews are part of a new reality in which right-wing religious leaders are thinking differently about American politics, and they are ennobled and empowered by the Republican Party in the 1980s and beyond.
For them. So, for example, you have the Orthodox and some of the Orthodox community, making new alliances with evangelical Christians, which they never really felt aligned with. So there's something that was brought to life in American Haredi world through Trump. We will see if it remains now that he's not in office, whether the Haredi will go back to being the kind of transactional political actors that they were before, or whether, what Trump awoke in the Haredi community really translates into a certain kind of Americanism. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing, that they're becoming more and more American. Most of the immigrants from Eastern Europe, mostly Holocaust survivors, are either elderly or no longer alive. So most of the Haredim are now American-born, sometimes second-generation American-born. And they have a certain kind of confidence in their Americanism, the way all first and second-generation Americans have. And so it's an interesting moment within Haredi Judaism in the 21st century in America that may result in a more kind of deeply embeddedness in the Haredi world, creating alliances and affiliations with other like-minded groups. Evangelical Christians would be one of them. Neoconservative political actors would be another. And we'll see whether they continue their kind of national political wokeness, so to speak, that was evoked through the Trump presidency as we move further on into the future.
And we slept for about an hour, and then my phone started ringing. My phone started ringing, and I answered it. And I heard gunshots. And I heard swear words. And I heard words like kike and whore. I hung up. As soon as I hung up, the phone rang again, and I answered it, and somebody said to me, "You should have died in the Holocaust with the rest of your people." And this was so weird. This was so bizarre. But it was also the moment that we realized people are actually listening to this post. This weird Nazi guy posted our information, and these people are actually going to carry out what they asked them to do, which was to try anything they could to drive me to the brink of suicide through intimidation and bullying and fear. And we realized, wow, we're in trouble. So technically what was happening is that I was being doxxed, and doxxed means when a call of action takes place to attack somebody and make their lives hell for any reason. And it's an all online attack. And they did tell these people to show up, to get me alone, to call me and ask me to show them real estate so they could get me alone and tell me what they thought of me when they were alone with me. But they didn't show up. They weren't coming for me. Where they were coming was online. But we weren't sure, were they coming? They were coming out of the woodworks everywhere. Besides emails and text messages and phone calls, it took me a little bit of time to realize that they started to attack my social media accounts. And when I say attack my social media accounts, it meant not just leave a bunch of terrible messages on my pages, but it meant attacking anybody that they could find that had anything to do with me through my social media. And through my social media, because I didn't have it on really high security, they were able to find everybody in Whitefish that had anything to do with anything Jewish. If they were in Whitefish and had a Jewish last name, or even sounded like a Jewish last name, or a Jewish business, they got attacked as well through my social media. And I started getting phone calls from local businesses saying, Tanya, what is happening? And during all of this time, the Spencer family was perpetuating the hate, perpetuating this fake story that I had extorted them. And I'll tell you, when you have thousands of people telling you that you're a dirty, awful, ugly, horrible person, it's hard not to start to doubt yourself and wonder, like, what did I do? What did I get myself involved in? And how did I let this happen to myself? And how did I let this happen? What was I thinking to get involved? Like, there was this sense of self-blame because they kept perpetuating the story, and I kept being told I was a dirty, ugly kike whore from thousands of people. And then getting blamed for other people in the community starting to get these messages. And you can imagine my peaceful life, how quickly it just got completely turned upside down.
So as if the incident in Lowell wasn't enough, apparently Massachusetts is a hotbed of anti-Semitic activity. I'm here in Duxbury, Massachusetts, where earlier in 2021, the football team was using anti-Semitic slurs as audibles on the field. Yes, people, Auschwitz, rabbi, gas chamber, dreidel. You cannot make this up.
Duxbury High School has removed its head football coach after anti-Semitic terms were used to call plays during a game.
He was also suspended from his teaching job. WBZ's Mike LaCrosse is live in Duxbury tonight with the breaking details. Mike?
David, Lisa, the district has also canceled the high school football program's games for later this week. This as they continue to investigate the incident.
Absolutely needs to be addressed and needs to be discussed, and as a community we need to come together.
Duxbury High School taking swift action today after the football team used anti-Semitic language while calling plays on the field during a recent game.
Heard, everything from Auschwitz to Holocaust to Hitler to gas chamber to dreidel.
The football team was using anti-Semitic play calls, and it wasn't brought up to the coach in the community from a Duxbury player, but it was brought up by a Plymouth player who heard the word Auschwitz and was understandably stunned to hear this, and spoke to his coach, who spoke to the AD, who spoke to our AD, and then kind of the whole story broke from there. It's my understanding where this started was many years ago. There was a Jewish quarterback, and the play call to go to the right was rabbit, and he turned it into rabbi. I seemed pretty harmless as a Jewish kid, kind of funny. I mean, I wouldn't have. I could see my kid doing something like that, actually. But over time, evidently, it evolved into using other Jewish terms. I don't know why, but evidently Auschwitz and gas chamber and other words that were not as benign as rabbi or dreidel. You hear, when you read, if you were to Google, this football incident, you will hear official mentions of dreidel and rabbi, and you do hear Auschwitz, but you don't hear some of the other terms that I think have been fairly well documented from former players were used. it's interesting. The first phone call I made when I heard about this happening was to a reporter who works for the Duxbury Clipper. He's the sports guy for the Clipper, and he's Jewish, and we're buddies. And I'm like, dude, did you hear it? Like, have you heard this? You're on the sidelines all the time. Like, I know if he heard it, he would have said something. And he didn't hear it. So you kind of have to be right on the field, or you have to be a coach who is part of this to know it.
I think people have become increasingly upset with the adults associated with the team, whether it's the coaches, and I know the head coach has been dismissed as the coach of the team. The article that I've read has to use the term fired. But he's not the only adult who knew that they were doing that. And so I think people are becoming more concerned that it's like, what is the culture that our kids are going to school in, what that tolerates this kind of stuff? And that is, I think, is the slow burn now. There was the shock of the initial thing that came out, but I think the slow burn that's not going away is how did the adults around these guys fail them so profoundly?
I think we were all, as community members, and for me as a parent, like, expected there to be a team apology. We understood that the whole team didn't know, but when you're on a team, if your team wins and you sat on the bench the whole time, you were part of a winning team. Also, if your team does something wrong, you're a team. Whether you knew about it or were involved, that's just what teams do. And so I think for me and most of the community, the most disappointing aspect of all this is the players wanted to write a letter and evidently crafted a very well-written letter in consultation with members of the school administration. And it's my understanding that some of the parents were not comfortable having a team apology. They didn't want their sons associated with this, because if they didn't apologize, then maybe nothing happened. Or if their son was attached to it, then maybe it would affect them getting into a college. Personally, as a mother of 3 college graduates, I think that the colleges would look more favorably upon them if they said, this was a horrible thing our team did, but they would expect a team apology. That's just good values. So to me, that was the biggest disappointment.
Okay, so anti-Semitism is everywhere. We've seen it, it's documentable, it happens every day. But apparently anti-Semitism doesn't rate protection on the diversity scale. Maybe we're not diverse enough.
One of the things we're going to work on is developing a program to train the kind of chief diversity officers across K-12, higher education, government agencies, private companies, to recognize that anti-Semitism is a threat and needs to be part of their mandate. And in a lot of cases, when you get a sense of creating chief diversity offices within institutions or hiring a chief diversity officer, they often see their mandate as protecting people of color, the LGBTQ community, the Muslim community, and all. The Jewish community often, and anti-Semitism often isn't seen as a priority mandate for whatever they're doing.
Free Beacon just broke the story of an anti-Semitic post from Google's global head of diversity strategy. Now, his name is Kamau Bob, where he claimed that Jewish people have quote, an insatiable appetite for war and killing. And this post is from 2007, and both Bob and Google have yet to comment on it. But what do you want to hear from in a statement from Google? I mean, who did the background checks? We always say people will check your stuff. How did they miss this? Megan.
I don't know. They're Google. They should have Googled him. I will say it's crazy. I know the statement. I want you to imagine if the statement was any black people, Asian people, LGBTQ people, any minority, quote, has an insatiable appetite for war and killing and an insensitivity to people suffering. Now, this man is in charge of diversity at Google. So if you're a Jewish employee of Google, I can't imagine how you feel right now. And after the events of the past few weeks, where we're seeing huge numbers of rises in anti-Semitic hate crimes in this country and globally, it's very strange to me that Google, who espouses itself to be, the most progressive, the most inclusive companies on planet Earth or in Silicon Valley, that you have a head of diversity that if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it looks like you probably hate Jews, or at the very least have some serious issues with your anti-Semitic rhetoric. And I am just quite frankly exhausted with having the conversation over and over again about why anti-Semitism is the last passable form of bigotry in the United States of America. Every woman on this show has an ancestor and a family member who fought in World War II. My great-grandfather died 4 days after signing the end of World War II on the USS Missouri. Now, all of our ancestors weren't out fighting Nazis to have this subtle anti-Semitism start seeping its way back into the American public's lexicon, which is what's happening right now. And we all know where that leads. It leads to the extermination of Jewish people. So Google, I implore you. They should at very least be putting out a statement, because if they said this about black people, or they said this about Asian people or LGBTQ people, he would be fired already, and he's not, which says that Google's okay with a little bit of soft anti-Semitism.
And we need to help create some kind of a training system, working with a consultant who can then explain what anti-Semitism is more and why it is this pernicious threat, and in fact how anti-Semitism is the root of a lot of the other issues involving white nationalism.
On the one hand, you're an American Jew in 2020 or 2019 or 2018. On the one hand, you have Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us. On the other hand, you have the Black Lives Matter protests, which many Jews are very supportive of. But yet, it's a community that is in large part sees Israel as part of the problem of white America. And another thing that's actually very interesting, I think this is a fascinating point that might be worth it to mention. Many American Jews have come out strongly against the critical race theory. Now, critical race theory is kind of interesting because one of the tenets of critical race theory, which makes Jews nervous, is that America is a white supremacist society. Why does that make Jews nervous? Because they see Jews as white people. So that in a certain sense, Jews who always saw themselves as the victims, who see themselves as being threatened by anti-Semitism, critical race theory comes along and says, yeah, we live in this racist white supremacist society, and the Jews are also white people. So you're on the side of the oppressors and not the victims. And in a way, Jews don't know how to they don't really know actually how to handle that. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that there's something called the 619 Project, which was part of critical race theory, which is a project that was developed by a number of African American scholars to create an educational curriculum to teach about slavery in America from the perspective of slaves. In other words, to look at history from the perspective of the victim. One of the interesting things about this, and there was a recent article by a colleague named Henry Abramson on this, was that it's strange for Jews to be against the 1619 Project, teaching slavery from the perspective of the slaves, because that's how Jews teach Jewish history. We're always teaching from the perspective of the victim. That's what Jewish history is, arguably. So in a certain sense, what Abramson is saying in his essay is like, we're always doing critical race theory. Jews are always doing critical race theory, except we're the victims. And now the tables have been turned, and suddenly we're part of the problem. And so I think, there's this I feel like American Jewry is in a vice on both sides. There's there's Charlottesville, and then there's, the Black Lives Matter protests. Now, Charlottesville was really not about the Jews. It was about the Confederate statues. It was about undermining, slavery and racism, and yet, Jews will not replace us. was one of the chants, which is kind of interesting because there was no chant that said blacks will not replace us. So Jews will not replace us, if you think about it, it's a kind of nonsensical thing because Jews make up less than 2% of the population, right? So are you going to replace, like, what does that actually mean? Jews are not really a threat, but yet they get sucked into the anger of white America as it sees itself slowly becoming a minority, and they get kind of they get kind of demonized for no other reason than there's just that history of demonization. And that's part of the anxiety of, white America. What do the Jews have to do with taking a Confederate statue down, right? But so it's interesting how these things kind of play themselves out, right? Now, of course, if you ask the Haredim, most of them probably don't even know about Charlottesville, right? They know about Pittsburgh, right? Jews get murdered, they'll know about that. But a bunch of white folks saying Jews will not replace us, for the Haredim, that's like, okay, so news at 11. Like, there's nothing new about that, right? But for other American Jews, it becomes very, very problematic.
We're not in the business, any of us, of ending anti-Semitism. Because that's not going to happen. Long after I'm dead, long after my great-grandchildren are dead, long after my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren are dead, there will be anti-Semitism. This isn't rocket science. Anti-Semitism has been around for at least 2 millennia, maybe more. And it's a pretty good bet it's going to be around for many, many centuries to come. We're not in the business of ending it. But if we can't end it, we can reduce it. I think the metaphor is a faucet. We can't turn the faucet off, but we sure as heck can turn it down. It was turned down after World War II and the Holocaust. We can do it again.
Southern Poverty Law Center. Southern Poverty Law Center. SPLC. I had no idea who they were. They showed up at our door. They said, Tanya, we have some information for you. My husband knew exactly who they were. They were a legal organization that has been fighting for social justice since the civil rights movement, since Dr. Martin Luther King. They have been fighting for civil rights in our country, and they have been suing hate groups and hate crimes. And it's a completely nonprofit organization. When I learned who they were, wow, that was an incredible sense of relief for me, that they cared. And it was a big deal. The SPLC doesn't just show up to little towns in Whitefish, Montana too often. And they showed up at my door and they said, Tanya, we've been following your story. We've been following what's been happening. We've been watching all of the website action. We've been following all the Nazi blogs and chat rooms for you. And we want to be part of making sure this never happens again. And they asked me, Tanya, would you consider suing these guys? And I didn't even hesitate. All I had to do was look at my sons. SPLC had been following the Daily Stormer for quite some time. They had done this to other people. Mostly they did it to politicians and reporters and people that were in the media. The fact that they were doing it to me and to my son, they crossed the line. They were using their First Amendment rights to ruin a life. That's crossing the line. You cannot use your First Amendment rights to destroy someone. That's where First Amendment ends. And I said, hell yes, sign me up. I didn't even hesitate. I looked at my husband, he looked at me, and I just turned and I said, yes, let's do this, let's fight. And we knew the risks. Of course we knew the risks. We knew that number one, there was going to be more media. The more media there is, the more hate that enters our lives. The more media there is, the longer it's going to take for my life to get back to normal. The more I'm involved in this, the crazier my life is going to get, the more I'm going to have to relive this story. But I had a choice. I could either live with being a victim for the rest of my life, or I could live with the fact that, hey, I was a fighter and I did what I could to right a wrong. How do you live with yourself if you stay silent? How do you stomach the pain and let the haters get away with it? I couldn't do it. I think that my parents taught me too much, they taught me chutzpah. That chutzpah means nerve and guts to stand up for what is right, and that's what I wanted my kids to remember. So I fought.
Okay, so now we understand how the strong man reels them in, but how does he get them to believe the bullshit?
So one of the eternal questions of authoritarianism is, how do these guys get people to believe their lies? And it starts with them forging a bond, of a charismatic bond with their large groups of people who come to believe him, believe anything he says, because they believe in him.
The political establishment is trying to stop us because they know we are a threat to their totally corrupt controls. I am a victim of one of the great political smear campaigns in the history of our country. They are coming after me to try and destroy what is considered by even them the greatest movement in the history of our country. There's never been anything like it.
And so once they forge that bond with him, they will accept what he says, either because they are just accepting it uncritically, but some of them know he's lying and or suspect that he's stretching the truth, and they approve of it because the strong man also poses as the teller of truths that the mainstream media that will not let out into the public. So they pose, and Hitler did this very well, they pose as almost victims of cancel culture, as we call it today.
I learned what was happening to me had a name. It was called being canceled. Canceled is what's happening to people around this country who refuse to be silenced by the far left. And often, the media is a willing participant. And I know you'll agree with me when we say that no one in this country has been a victim of unfair media coverage more than President Donald Trump. I believe this country must unite around a president who calls the media out and refuses to allow them to create a narrative instead of reporting the facts.
And the Nazis, by the way, in the 1920s, and I have this poster in my book, Strongmen, the Nazis used Hitler being banned briefly by some German states in the mid-1920s for his hate speech as political capital. And they created posters that showed Hitler canceled with his mouth taped shut. And this got them more popularity. So the strongman, from the fascist to Trump, has posed as a teller of truths that others don't want to hear.
Well, Donald Trump has a straightforward way that he communicates.
And he's not a dummy, like everybody seems to think. You don't make $1 billion being an idiot. So I think he's smart enough to run the country.
He says the things that needs to be said.
About what? What's important to you?
The truth that nobody else says.
And he's an authentic person. So this is how people, even if they think what he's saying might not be accurate, they like the fact that he's giving the middle finger to the establishment. So again, either they're not aware that he's telling lies because his disinformation and his personal charisma has worked its magic on them. or they know he's lying and they approve of the lying as a way of delegitimizing mainstream media and a whole worldview which strongmen attack of objectivity, of evidence-based knowledge, of science. And we see now in our country the tragic effects of this with people who don't believe in vaccines. And at the latest at this conservative political action conference, people were cheering low vaccination rate.
They were hoping, the government was hoping, that they could sort of sucker 90% of the population into getting vaccinated, and it isn't happening.
And this is magical thinking that comes with the strongman.
I've never been, I've been very slow to say that Donald Trump caused this to happen to me. And I've also been incredibly afraid that I already feel like so many people hate me. I've received so much hate in my life over the last many years. I didn't want to invite half the country hating me because I took a side politically. But I've reached a point that I can't deny and I can't be quiet about anymore the fact that the reason this happened to me is because Donald Trump was elected president of our country. He unleashed hate in this country. He made it trendy. He single-handedly emboldened the underdog and gave them the chutzpah to say whatever the heck they wanted to whoever they wanted to. And that's why Richard Spencer had the chutzpah to organize a conference that people actually came to in Washington, D.C. and stand up in front of a group of people and hail our president. This happened right after the election. He felt emboldened to do that. So yes, I blame Donald Trump. There is no denying it. It's not something I've decided. It just is the case.
So as you can see, aside from scholars and journalists and community activists and Tanya, I got nobody to talk to me about Trumpism, Israel, the rise of anti-Semitism, the Orthodox community, nothing. Am I really the only angry Jew out there who was willing to talk in public?
Well, I don't think you're the only one who is. I mean, it's interesting that you raise that question. I just very recently came out with a book, a cultural biography of Meir Kahane. And, Meir Kahane was a militant rabbi in the 1960s, founded the Jewish Defense League. And Rabbi Kahane, Meir Kahane, was the angry Jew. He was precisely the person who was saying exactly what you were saying in 1968 after the Ocean Hill-Brownsville school strike, that Jews are not angry, right? Jews have been hypnotized by a certain kind of liberalism and a belief that America will take care of them. And when these anti-Semitic incidents happened in Ocean Hill-Brownsville, in Harlem, in a number of other places, that they didn't really react. And so, Kahane's popularity was that he was able to plug into young Jews, many of whom were children of Holocaust survivors or children of immigrants, to basically say, yeah, we have to be angry, we're going to out and protest, we're going to basically go with like nunchucks and brass knuckles and bats, and we're going to basically fight violence with violence. That kind of imploded by the early 70s. I think basically what happened was that American Jews saw Kahane, they saw the militarism, they saw the anger, and they were afraid of that, and they were afraid that it was going to erode the inroads that they made into a certain kind of assimilation or acculturation into American society. And I think they kind of backed down. Now, it is true that by 73, 74, and the Vietnam War, the impeachment of Nixon, militarism had diminished in America anyway. You had the Black Panthers, you had the Young Lords, right? You had these militant groups in the late 60s and early 70s. You had the Weather Underground and the SDS. That kind of disappeared. And in a way, American Jews kind of went back to their lives. They went back to believing that America ultimately was their home, and that they wanted to be a part of the larger liberal American system, and that would best serve them as a community.
Another thing to keep in mind is Jewish affiliation is at an all-time low in America. Just 1 out of 3 American Jews affiliates with any Jewish institution. That's according to the Pew Foundation as well. So that means a Jewish institution could be a synagogue, a JCC, or really anything, any nonprofit that's Jewish, or any Jewish organization. So you have such low affiliation, but the Jews who do affiliate do care. But the numbers are so low, and they slant toward an older population, a senior population. People who are senior citizens, people who are 60 and over. So you don't have the young activists marching in the street per se against anti-Semitism en masse. Yes, you have some. You have some very committed college students who are facing some awful anti-Semitism on campus because it's been orchestrated by some very savvy groups who are anti-Israel and who have some strong feelings about Israel, and they marginalized and quieted the Jewish voice on campus, the active Jewish voice. So there's a lot of things going on here that make Jews want to not say anything. There's a phrase in Yiddish, shah still, and that applies here now, especially with younger Jews who identify as Jews, but who really are afraid to speak out.
Charlie, you mentioned something that was a little bit surprising to me at first blush when you brought it up to me, that you've had a hard time finding Jewish people who would talk about anti-Semitism or their Jewish experience right now. And it was surprising to me because it just, in my Jewish community, we talk about this all the time. It's what we talk about. But in reflecting a little bit more after the last few days since you mentioned it to me and having conversations with my family, I can see some reasons behind it, and they're not unique to this time. I think that during the Trump years, the bandage was, sort of like the gloves were off. Like, people didn't feel that they had to hide their racism and their anti-Semitism. I mean, look at the march in Charlottesville. People weren't wearing hoods. They were comfortable showing their faces. It was not something to be ashamed of or worrying about getting in trouble because it was fine. They were given permission to be openly anti-Semitic and racist. I was part of a summer program dealing with the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, and a gentleman, Noam Weissman, who does Jewish studies in Los Angeles, was one of our speakers. And actually, he there's a term he used that I really liked. I don't like the term, but I felt it was better than anti-Semitism. Let's call it what it is. It's Jew hate. Like, that's really, like, yeah, that's what it is. And So one of the statistics he gave is 2% of the US population is Jewish. Yet for hate crimes in the United States, crimes against Jews is a higher number than all the other groups combined.
When I was a younger person, when I was 13 years old, I said that I grew up in a small town in New Jersey, and that town had initially been inhabited by Jewish chicken farmers. And then when the Jewish chicken farmers left, because they really couldn't make a business there, it became inhabited by mostly Christians. There were very few Jewish people that I went to school with. I had a class of 750 in my high school alone. There were 2 high schools in the town. And there were probably a total of 10 of us in my high school graduating class. Before I went to high school, in junior high, I was carrying my lunch tray, and some girls didn't like me. And as I walked down the middle of the lunch tables, they had everyone in the cafeteria throw pennies at me. And it was humiliating, and it was horrifying. I never forgot those girls. I will never forget those girls. And that's when I said to myself, they did that because I was Jewish. Now I'm going to make sure everybody knows I'm Jewish. So what concerned me about Trump was that I knew hate from a long time ago. And I didn't think that there were more people that hated. I think that there were people that openly hated. So all the people that talked about it privately in their house, because it has to come from somewhere. It has to evolve. If nobody talks about it, then, if you have children and you don't talk about hate, then they don't know to hate. But if you hate in your house, the kids hate, and they teach the hate to their friends and then their children, and it becomes basically a snowball. And I think that's what happened, that people that hated quietly now hated openly. And I think it was a horrible, horrible 4 years.
And I think one of the ways of looking at it is, the non-Orthodox, certainly non-Haredi community that is experiencing now what it considers to be a rise in the problem of anti-Semitism, which is a much bigger question. Certainly a rise in the incidence of anti-Semitism. And the kind of surprise and shock that we find in some of those individuals and communities in terms of, obviously, the Pittsburgh massacre is just the one example everybody points to. Haredim are never surprised by anti-Semitism. The Haredim live in a world, in a mindset where anti-Semitism is always there and it's always all over the place. And in a certain sense, there's not a shock in the Haredi world when there's a rise in anti-Semitic incidents. Now, obviously, Haredim suffer from anti-Semitism more than non-Orthodox Jews because they're more discernible as Jews. So, in a certain sense, they're the ones that are really on the front lines, and yet, I don't think you find in the Haredi world a real sense of kind of, holding one's pearls, so to speak, and the kind of oh my godism that you hear in the news media, or that you hear in the blogosphere, or in Jewish circles. It's kind of like, yeah, this is what it is. This is what it is, and even as bad as it is in America, it's much better than it was where they came from. And so I don't really see that that's going to build bridges. In a certain sense, the Haredim have become more tolerant of non-Orthodox Jews, largely because they're more American in a way. And I think that there's a certain kind of tolerance that becomes more prominent in an experience where they're not afraid of the Cossacks. They're not afraid of the Nazis. They're not afraid of the things that the European Jews were really afraid of. They feel very confident in their Americanness. And they feel, in a certain sense, very confident that the American political system will protect them. Now, they're nervous about it, in a way, but I don't think they have the same kind of anxiety that you find in the non-Orthodox or more modern Jewish communities.
To deal with anti-Semitism, you need to know where it's coming from and the kind of tropes it uses at any given time and place. And when I hear someone say, well, anti-Semitism is all about right-wing nationalist anti-Semitism, or anybody says, oh, it's all about left-wing political anti-Semitism, or it's about Muslims, I become very suspicious. Be a little more complex than that, because the problem is quite complex. And be a little more humble about where it might come from tomorrow. If you're really going to fight it, you need allies on the right and on the left, among ethnic minorities, among Christian groups, among Muslim groups, etc. And understanding at a given point in time what the problem is the only way to begin to push back.
There is one ray of hope. On January 5th, 2020, there was a solidarity march called No Fear, No Hate at Cadman Plaza in Manhattan. It brought together 25,000 people. The Jewish community, the Muslim community, the African American community all came together to denounce hate, to denounce bigotry, to denounce racism. And it was a day when I think you could see maybe we can all come together.
We are perpetuating our own anti-Semitism right now. Trump unleashed it, and we are fueling it because we are judging one another. We are telling some Jews they're too extreme, and we're telling some Jews that they're too liberal and too reform. Nonsense. We're Jewish. That's it. Like Greeks are Greek, okay? Like Italians are Italian. We're Jewish, we're Jewish. It runs through our bloods. We cannot take it out of them. We can't. It's like, it's us. It's not a belief, everybody. It's not lighting candles. It is not keeping kosher. Our Reform communities, our secular communities, have to start sending love and understanding and respect to our Orthodox communities. Our Orthodox communities have got to drop their high horses and stop looking at secular Jews as not being Jewish. That's ridiculous. Not to mention, we have like this fundamental belief as Jews, right? Absolutely, break down Judaism to the core. We stand for one thing. And in America, if you're not Jewish and you're listening, they are people that above anything else, you take care of someone else before you take care of you. If you're hungry and you have a piece of bread, you share that one minuscule piece of bread with someone else, even if they're not Jewish. Now tell me, what is to hate about that? That's it. It's all kind of broken down to that. That and the fact that we've been around for thousands of years and we're like, doing what our ancestors have taught us, and it's a beautiful religion. It's so beautiful, and it's so peaceful, and it's so loving. Why are we hated? What's to hate? Tell me. What is to hate about a Jewish person? There is not a teaching out there in Judaism that hates or hurts another person. So stop the hate, please.
So when I initially started this documentary, my plan was to highlight Trumpism, the rise of anti-Semitism, and the Jews who supported him, who I blamed for A, him being in office, and B, the rise of anti-Semitism that followed. But after months and months of hate and intolerance filtering through my brain, making this movie, and all the people that I spoke to, I sort of changed the way I'm thinking about things. We're all Jews, just like Tanya said, and we're not doing ourselves any favors by hating each other, by calling each other out. There are people who actually hate us for being Jews. They're out there. It's documented. I documented it in the film. We can't be those people. We on the left have to respect the Orthodox community on the right. And the Orthodox community on the right has got to respect the Jews who don't think like them, because we're all Jews. We can't hate each other because everybody else hates us. So I've really changed my ideas about this. I grew up in New York. My family's from Williamsburg. I grew up with definite ideas about the Hasidic community in Williamsburg and Crown Heights. And they bordered on anti-Semitism. I'm not proud of it, but it's true. We can't do that anymore. We just can't. So now, I hope this film gives people a chance to think and talk and possibly come together on some level. It's the best we can hope for. Shalom.